Good evening from Abu Dhabi. I'm John Defterios, the emerging markets editor of CNN, and we have a fantastic panel ahead for the next hour. I am one that has covered the Abraham Accords very carefully and looked with amazement how we've gone to not be able to make phone calls from the UAE to Israel, to a full engagement, including Bahrain, with Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain, looking at a number of different sectors for development. The initial reaction was that these are a series of MOUs or memorandums of understanding, and it wouldn't lead to concrete development and commerce. Those who thought so are highly mistaken. What we're finding out in the early stages of this, that the MOUs are quickly being converted into transactions, and that the two cultures share a common DNA for business, which I think is extraordinary. And this is a discussion about business and development leading to peace and lasting peace, and perhaps even solving the issue of the Palestinians, which is a cause that's been a struggle for decades. But the best chance, as the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs has said here in the UAE, is to not leave an empty seat at the table and actually have a dialogue together, but with business driving the dialogue that leads to a longer lasting peace in terms of negotiations. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists and set the ground rules for our discussion for the hour. First, Her Excellency Urit Farkash Haqqan. She's the Minister of Tourism from Israel with a great deal of background in the cabinet. Welcome to you. His Excellency Dr. Ahmed Baoul Al-Falasi, the Minister of State for Entrepreneurship and Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises here in the UAE. Great to see you, Doctor. And finally, my distinguished minister joining us from Bahrain, His Excellency Zayed Al Zayani, the Minister of Industry, Commerce and Tourism, and has added to the portfolio managing the exhibitions for the Bahrain Tourism and Exhibitions Authority as chairman. Gentlemen and Minister from Israel, it's great to have you on board for the discussion. I'd like to start with our guests from Israel first in this context of the world travel market. In your view, what makes tourism such a specific sector that can lead to lasting peace? And the reason I ask that, Orit, is that in the first 24 hours when we were sitting here in the UAE, we immediately saw videos from both sides, Israel and the UAE, showing the destinations, showing the enthusiasm to travel, and it's led to direct flight developments as well. But what's specific in your views about tourism and lasting peace and cultural development between countries?
When I approached the Israeli parliament congratulating about the important agreement of normalization between Israel and the Emirates and Israel and Bahrain, I quoted our late Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who brought historic peace between Israel and Egypt. And in his statement to the Israeli parliament, he talked about tourism. And not surprisingly, while saying tourism, people moving between countries is the expression of true peace. So this is where I come from. I think that governments sign contracts and agreements and normalization clauses, but people are the true expression of peace. And in that sense, progressing with tourism, with the movement of people and different cultures and being exposed to each other with mutual respect and with respect to the other countries' tradition and beliefs and their ways of life can bring us all together, I think, in a much better way than all other, treaties can do.
Yeah, it's fascinating you say that. I wanted to bring in His Excellency Dr. Al-Falasi, the Minister for State Enterprises and Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises as well. And this is a sector, tourism, which can support the development of SMEs, but we've had a cabinet reshuffle here in the UAE, which has emphasized artificial intelligence, advanced technology, as you well know. How does this feed into the startup culture, which should actually support the tourism sector at the same time, would you suggest, Dr. Ahmed?
Absolutely. So, as you know, Israel has been very well known to be a hub for startups, specifically in high-tech technologies. And I think this Abraham Accord will really help both the UAE being a hub for the Middle East and North Africa, and Israel being a technology hub to really have a flow of entrepreneurs, a flow of investments to enrich the ecosystem, both countries, but also on the tourism side. If I were to refer to my previous role in higher education, we used to send some students to study abroad. And sometimes when parents ask me for advice, I say, look, it's not only about the academic aspect. So we do have good universities in the UAE, NYU, Abu Dhabi, Paris, Sorbonne, and so forth. But going abroad and living abroad and being exposed to different cultures really opens up your perspective and makes you more tolerant, more accepting of others. And that's something that I've done myself as well with my own kids. We do travel a lot and we try to go to different countries every single time because it really opens up cultures. And I think tourism will play a major role. Besides the direct economic impact, it will also open up the prospect of bringing these two cultures together, and we'll soon come to realize that we have much more in common than we think we have differences.
Yeah, Dr. Ahmed, maybe just follow up quickly before I bring our minister in from Bahrain. There was almost a thirst to have the engagement, right? After so many decades apart and not having this a formal relationship, it triggered something amazing, what I saw. And the first one was to share pictures, to share videos, to share the experiences on both sides between Israel and the UAE. Am I correct in saying that there was a thirst or a hunger to see Israel and vice versa?
Absolutely, absolutely. We've seen lots of videos going viral on both sides, in Israel and the UAE. I've actually had friends of mine looking into resorts, and I spoke to Her Excellency, Minister of Tourism in Israel, that people are very excited to not only visit, but also to have second homes potentially. So I think, as I said before, people are really anxious about when would these direct flights be launched. And as you know, Fly Dubai is already starting on the 26th of November, 14 weekly flights, which is a significant number of flights for a first destination. So we really expect a big inflow and outflow of tourists. And we did have technically our first tourists were the Minister of Economy and our Minister of State for Financial Affairs. But that's only two people, right? We need to get more of them into Israel and also accept more Israeli tourists. And speaking also of thirst, there's also thirst not only from the tourists themselves, but also from the tourism sector, from the hospitality sector. We're already seeing, as we speak, hotels starting to introduce kosher meals. So they're already getting ready to receive Israeli tourists. So we're not going to wait until the first commercial flight takes off. We're getting ready today.
Yes, I saw that also with Emirates in terms of the catering. Zayed Al-Zayani, I'd love to get your thoughts on this common DNA I was talking about in my opening remarks. And also the fact there's very little overlap. If I look at both Bahrain and the UAE and then compare it to Israel, it's complementary, but there's no competing forces in certain sectors. Does that make a difference as you start to forge business which leads to peace, in your view?
Thank you, John. I think you're right in a way that we are complementary, but we also have a lot of overlap in the DNAs of our economies. Especially Bahrain, we are not as oil rich as our neighbors, so we have a lot of diversity within our economy. And when we look at a closer look at the Israeli composition of their economy too, it seemed to be well diversified and driven by technology and IT. In Bahrain also, this is the strategy of the government moving forward. We want to empower the youth, the new generation. We have a young population, relatively speaking, and we want to create wealth and education and opportunity for those young Bahrainis. There's a lot of commonalities with Israel and Bahrain. The sense of entrepreneurship, the pride in creating, and being small nations. I think we have to distinguish ourselves by being so. Bahrain is an island nation, so we've been a 4,000-year-old tradition of trading and exposed to other cultures. We've been on the Silk Route, we've been on the trading routes between India and Africa and Mesopotamia. So it's nothing new for us to embrace a new culture or to get exposed to one. And it's nothing new to receive another culture. For years, we have been isolated from each other. I think we have a golden opportunity now to explore new ventures with each other. We have got on to a very good start on a government level. There's a lot of excitement on the public level. I've been a minister for 6 years, and I've never received calls from businessmen or friends who say, well, when you go to this country, please make me part of the delegation. But everyone I see and I talk to us and make sure I'm with you when you go to Tel Aviv or to Israel. So there's a lot of opportunity to do business. We're very excited about it. There's a lot of culture exchange. One unique factor about Bahrain is that we have a Jewish Bahraini community in Bahrain. And that we feel will facilitate because we are living harmoniously with them. We've had a Jewish synagogue in Bahrain since 1935. We've had our first, we were the first nation to have a Jewish ambassador in DC in 2008, a Bahraini ambassador. So they're well tuned into the fabric of our society. It's for us, we don't have any inhibitions with religion. It's nothing new to us. We're well connected, and I feel, I mean, the name, the Abraham Accord, I think was a fabulous name, you know, to find the common root and to go back to that. And that will help us a lot in getting the future built up together.
Good. Can I ask you a personal question? Did you ever think this day would happen, Syed, as a minister? Did you ever think it would happen in your lifetime or as a minister in our kind of generation, because we were about the same age?
I knew it would happen eventually. I didn't expect it to happen so fast, to be honest, and I didn't expect it to be received so well too. I thought it will be, you know, shy steps to begin with. You have to remember, we are not Egypt or Jordan where we have borders, land borders with Israel, so it's more geographically close by. But I'm very excited that I witnessed it. I'm very excited that I was part of it. I'm very excited that I've been honored by His Highness the Crown Prince to lead the economic team from Bahrain on all discussions with economic issues with the State of Israel. And I really look forward to visiting and having people visit us from Israel. Of course, we've had a delegation here on the 18th of October from Israel. And we also served them kosher food when they were here. So we're ready for that. And we look forward to visiting soon. So I've been told what are the nice hotels in Tel Aviv and where I should stay. So we're preparing for that.
I can give you a few tips. I was doing 1 Square Meter, our real estate development program in Tel Aviv, or at just a few years ago, looking at the property boom. I wanted to ask you, if I may, Minister of Tourism, what developments are we seeing in preparation for the new visitors coming from the Gulf states, would you suggest, Minister? I think your mic is muted.
Sorry.
No problem.
I wanted to say that we are very excited on every level, and we're looking forward for the skies to open, and so we can have the guests from the Emirates and Bahrain. If I can say on a personal note, I've been hearing the minister from the Emirates, Mr. Ahmed Baalul, and my colleagues from Bahrain, Mr. El Zayani, and it's pretty exciting. I must tell you that I'm feeling like we're witnessing a history unfolding, because for me to be a part of such a panel, such a respected panel, talking about the common, what binds us together, how to respect each other, you know, for me personally is very, very exciting. When I had my introduction conversation on the phone with Mr. Baalul from the Emirates, we discovered we both have a background from energy. We used to work in the energy field. So it is all about the people. And I really feel that there is such a great chemistry between the two peoples, and the three peoples, sorry. And now what are we doing So first of all, there are treaties, like my colleagues were saying. We are progressing to the signing of treaties of collaboration in the realms of tourism, in commerce, and many other areas, both with the Emirates and with Bahrain, hopefully really soon in the following coming weeks. We as Israelis, we are preparing for Muslim visitors. You know, up to now, the really, not a majority, I would say, very little amount of Muslim tourists was present in Israel. So we are preparing for that in the sense of preparing, you know, tour guides to have better Arabic. So we will have you know, people that are trained to instruct and to be able to give the services in Arabic. We are also talking about the halal, I would say the Muslim version of the kosher, the restriction, the religious limitations of Muslim food. We want our friends to feel at home. We want them to be able to be comfortable with their beliefs in every hotel, wherever they go. We are even planning on maybe, making 1 + 1 + 1 5. We think it's an opportunity maybe to create combined marketing packages so that people that are coming can come to see the Emirates and in Jerusalem. And maybe if we can even do that, we can, even raise the value of tourism in our part of the world. And I think it's only a wish. We just published in the Ministry of Tourism, by the way, do and don't to the Emirates. That was done by one of the experts in the ministry to prepare Israelis of a different culture. We are very straightforward as Israelis, to let them know we should be a little bit more polite with our friends and so on. I'm joking. But the cultural differences of how to respect, to know about the limitations of alcohol, to know that they are very, very generous hostess, to tell them a little bit about the culture so that when the skies open, it will all go smoothly.
Great. Let me bring in Dr. Ahmed here and get a sense of what facilitation you're doing on your side here for the UAE. As Minister Farkash Hakohen was suggesting, there is movement by the government to support this tourism and to support development in the sector to welcome Israelis into the UAE. You want to give us a taste of what's already underway, Dr. Ahmed?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the first thing we did was to have meetings with all the tour operators and the DMCs and destination management companies. And as you know, the UAE is quite unique in that it's one of the rare countries with the majority of tourism coming in from international tourists. So about 77.4% are international tourists and only 22.6% are domestic. Now that's great when you have an upcycle, but when you have a down cycle in the economy, it really takes a toll. So hospitality has benefited from residents and nationals trying to take a quick break, a staycation. However, DMCs and tour operators have no line of sight until at least a year from now. So adding a new country like Israel with people or tourists who are really hungry to visit the UAE, it really is for them highly beneficial with the recovery, simply because we're that much exposed to international tourism. So we had a meeting with them. We've explained to them the expectation. The visa-free entry was established on October 20th. And the first, as I said before, the Fly Dubai will be flying on the 26th of November. So there are questions being raised about connecting them with tour operators in Israel, and we've done that. And aside from that, there weren't much, I would say, in terms of do's and don'ts, because we naturally cater for a breadth of international tourists. So the tour operators and DMCs are quite comfortable dealing with a lot of international tourists. When you come to the citizens, I think the UAE as well is an interesting country. You have about 85 to 90% of people in the UAE are actually international residents. So by default, we are international, we are a melting pot. I think Israel is just one flavor into that pot that will make it that much tastier, I think.
Good. It's interesting. Minister Farkash Hakohen talked about it briefly, so did Mr. Al-Zayani. But could we see, Minister Al-Zayani, a collaboration of the first wave of those who have signed on to the Abraham Accords, where you actually do the joint packages? Can we get it there where you say to visitors that are coming from Asia, let's do a 3-hop collaboration with each other? How far-fetched is that at this stage, would you suggest?
I think it is very much doable. And when we talked for the first time, me and my Israeli counterpart, I mentioned to Her Excellency that by coincidence, our stand at ITV and WTM is always next to Israel. And many times I've wandered in and looked at brochures and resorts in Israel in different cities. And going back to your question, I always ask myself, will I ever live to visit them? Now it's a reality. And maybe fate put us next to each other in these international exhibitions, but now it's up to us really to link it even closer and to make it work. There is definitely an interest here from the tourism industry in Bahrain, like our colleagues in the UAE, the DMCs and the tour operators. They are willing to get engaged with their Israeli counterparts. Today, in the weekly cabinet meeting in Bahrain, the cabinet approved the air transport agreement of Israel. So that's going for ratification now. Once that is signed up, of course, we can start flights before that on an MOU basis. And we are hopeful to launch flights at the beginning of next year directly between Bahrain and Israel. I think with air connectivity, that will boost tourism both ways. There is a lot of interest I see from Israeli companies as well, who have approached us. I'm also the chairman of Gulf Air, our national carrier, and I see a lot of requests on Gulf Air from people in Israel in the tourism industry, not just travel agencies, but ground handlers, GSAs, people in the aviation sector, not just the tourism sector. So there's definitely a potential there, and I think it will be the hot destination for this region both ways. Israelis would love to come and see the Gulf, Bahrain and UAE, and Bahrainis and Emiratis would like to go and see Israel.
I wanted to let our audience know that we're taking questions. So there's a chat box here on the Zoom platform, of course, and go ahead and feed them in. It's an opportunity to ask three expert ministers their ideas on the development going forward. I would hope at this stage, or at Prakash Hakohen, that this doesn't become overly dependent on government. And what I mean by that, now that the governments have agreed, will business and the tourism sector take it and run with it? It's not something that's overly dependent on the peace process, but more on development because the paths have been laid already. What are your views on that?
I think that the people, the industries, the private sector, the tourism industry is going to put things in a fast forward motion. And I think we can already see that in reality. From what we know, there is a business conference that is led by the prominent Israeli business sector to be held in the Emirates in a few weeks, led by one of the largest financial institutions in Israel. And it is already, there is a date set, and they are already on their way to the Emirates to create the relationships. When I opened today's most leading newspaper in Israel, it has a special segment, a special edition, a whole sector talking about tourism with the Emirates and Bahrain, and about what opportunity does it hold to family tourism, to business people, what every country holds, and so on. Everybody is very excited in Israel about going forward. And where business is, where interest is, where excitement is, there comes the doing. And I can say that when it comes to Israel, we have a lot to offer as well. If it comes to business tourism, like Mr. El-Zayani said, and Mr. Bechalul said, regarding the high-tech and innovation industry and so on. But not less than that, we have also, a very small country and an opportunity for those countries to come not far away from home, to feel still at home, but at the same time to feel they come to something totally different. If we're talking about historic sites or ancient sites like Caesarea, Akko, the Dead Sea Wonders, and Jerusalem, alongside with a very, very modern country, one of the most modern countries in the world, like Tel Aviv. We also offer a lot of religious important sites to the Islam. If we're talking about Nebi Musa, Nebi Samuel, Dome of the Rock, and of course the Al-Aqsa Mosque. All of that will create something with a very interesting flavor, like my colleague just said, and I love what he said about adding another flavor to the melting pot. And we hope we can make a use of all of that. But trust me, I think my challenge would be to catch up with the people of the industry and the business people. I don't know if you're aware of, but already right now, equity funds, investment funds from Dubai, from the Emirates, are starting to locate and to have offices in Tel Aviv. When we're talking about major transactions in Israel, then we see interest in many assets and tenders and so on. So in that sense, I think that we will have to keep the pace of the people in that area, and we hope we hope we can face that challenge and accommodate the experience so that my friends will feel in Israel at home.
Great. We have a lot of questions coming in, but I wanted to ask one more of Dr. Ahmed, and that is, there's been an incredible level of testing here in the UAE during COVID-19, and kind of a trust built up here. What did we learn from that experience in terms of security, safety, testing that would put comfort for the Israeli visitors coming in to the UAE? What was the takeaway, do you think, in this kind of super challenging 11 months that we faced in 2020?
Absolutely. I think when it comes to tourism, it's one of the sectors where you're not going to conduct that business unless you feel 100% safe. And we've taken that very seriously. In the absence of a widely accepted vaccine and widely deployed vaccine, there's no other solution simply but testing. So I think the numbers speak for themselves. Today, the number of tests conducted in the UAE far surpasses the total population. We've conducted 14 million tests. We're a country that's shy of 10 million. That includes, obviously, the transit passengers as well. But again, I just got another test today, to go to Abu Dhabi tomorrow. So tests are in our DNA, and they're quite quick in terms of response time. So I've conducted my test earlier this morning. I got the result within 3 hours. And beyond just the simple testing, we've also established a COVID-19 safe requirement with the hotels to ensure that all these hotels will not be able to operate unless they stick to very strict measures when it comes to everything from sterilization to the laundry service and so forth. So I think I'm very comfortable to say that probably the UAE would be one of the safest locations globally, simply because of the mass testing being conducted, and two, because of the rigor when it comes to recertifying all the hospitality outlets to start receiving tourists. And as the case with any country, we do have also levels. So when we see that the daily rate exceeds the medium average, we put in tough measures and we put in more social distancing measures. And interestingly enough, the amount of adherence to the government requirement is to me an eye-opener. Not only on a personal level where people are actually wearing masks, but also on the business side. Remember, these are F&B outlets, hotels, retail shops who've been dying to get customers. They still stick to the limit and the spaces as well. So adherence has been a key factor for the success of the UAE. So again, safest place in the world so far, the UAE.
So you think it's important that, in fact, that the trust has been built up and the testing has been incredibly resilient in terms of getting response time. A question for the minister from Bahrain, Mr. Al-Zayani. When are you going to establish an embassy, or are you going to exempt the Israelis from obtaining visas over there? It's not the clearest language, but are there plans for the embassy to be established? And how easy you plan to make it for visa clearance for Israelis coming into Bahrain, Minister?
I think during the delegation that visited Bahrain, there was an accord signed to exempt diplomatic and special passports from visas, and to set a protocol for the general passports for both countries. That's being discussed currently between the ministries of foreign affairs between the two countries. And part of the discussion also is to establish diplomatic missions in both countries. So that's an ongoing process. We think it will be quite soon. And part of it will be sorting out the visa issues. If I may add, John, just on
Please.
My colleague from the UAE, I think the GCC region as a whole has been one of the best regions in the world in handling the COVID situation. And I think that comes down to transparency and consistency. We've had our policies from day one and we've stuck to them. We've swallowed the bitterness at the beginning, and we stuck to it, and we kept a sense of moderation, trying to balance as much as we can health issues with economic issues. In Bahrain, for example, we started our first official COVID meeting was on the 23rd of January. That was almost 5 weeks before we had a case reported in Bahrain. And that was a task force set by His Highness the Crown Prince, and we started planning what if we had COVID in Bahrain. And we kept meeting twice a week till today, every Tuesday and Thursday, to talk about issues related to COVID. And throughout, because of that early start, we never closed our airport, we never closed our borders throughout. We kept connectivity with the rest of the world wherever permitted. And we've maintained a moderate policy between health and economics. We never had a total shutdown. We never had curfews in Bahrain. And like the UAE, we've relied on two things: intensive testing and contact tracing. It was very important for us to contact trace the positive cases and immediately react and isolate their friends and relatives and co-workers, so we make sure that the disease doesn't spread to bigger circles. And I think that consistency and that determination from the governments in the GCC has led to this relatively safe zone when you compare it to other places in the world. And this is why we are in a position today, whether in the UAE or in Bahrain, to open up and to receive tourists without any quarantine requirements when they arrive here. Both of our countries are probably one of the very few countries in the world that doesn't require any quarantine for arrivals into the country.
Great. Something triggered my mind when you were discussing about the security. I was also going to ask Minister Farkash Hakohen the same. I'm talking about the real security safety that we see both in the Gulf states and Israel. This, again, is a common DNA. And I think travelers would feel really secure in both destinations of the Gulf and Israel. Would you agree with me, Minister Farkash?
Sure, I think so. The private, the citizens' security, self-security in Israel is relatively very high. I remember when I lived with my family a year abroad, then I thought that the personal security feeling in Israel is among the highest possible. You know, we have our geographical concerns and our geopolitical concerns, but when it comes to safety in the street and so on, I think we're doing pretty good. Regarding the COVID-19, we are also just coming out of a second lockdown. And we have the COVID under control. Just like my colleagues said, we are periodically, every day, we are measuring the amount of the people that had examinations and how much we have and how much we not. We have a criteria by which if we pass the criteria and if we deteriorate a little bit, then we put some more extreme measures to control. And I think that in that front, there is not a lot of news. We are just doing what everybody is doing. With regard to tourism, though, we opened the village tourism because it's more healthy and it is open and it's in private houses along the landscapes and in the desert areas and in Ramat Golan and Galilee area, which are more in the nature. And as we speak, we are going to hopefully pass a law today that will basically conduct a little experience in our strongest tourism for the interior, for the people of Israel on cities in the Dead Sea, hotels in the Dead Sea, and hotels in Eilat, which is in the north of the country. We are trying to define them as green islands of tourism, and they will be open like a extra territorial territories by which every person that will show that he has a positive, not a negative COVID-19 result, which means an okay that they don't have the virus, will be able to go and stay at a hotel there and enjoy a vacation there.
Great. I had a question that came in for you. When is Israel going to affirm the treaty with the UAE? And it will allow Israeli tourists to go there. Is there a timeline here to affirmation for Israel and the UAE?
From what I know, I mean, it is in a very mature progress. We passed the agreement already through the foreign ministry, and it is hopefully in the next few weeks. I think that I spoke with my colleagues with Mr. Bahlul, and they are working, they are doing things by the book, and they are positive, and they are just now going over the agreements, the MOUs, and you know, everything is on a very positive process to be finalized in the following weeks.
Great. Dr. Ahmed, I'd love to hear your thoughts here about the relationship between SMEs and the tourism sector here. Do you have the new generation coming up with ideas and saying, wow, this is quite a unique opportunity here, and it'll spawn some startups related to tourism, which has had a very difficult 2020 and is now just starting to heal? And then we had words of vaccine progress coming from Pfizer in the United States today. How do you think the energy will be applied here to startups in the tourism sector, in your view?
Absolutely. So as you know, the global tourist preferences are changing, and we're seeing a lot more tourists that are tech heavy and tech savvy. And we've already incorporated that into our products. So if you go to the historical sites, the old sites in Dubai and Abu Dhabi as well, you'll notice that they are all equipped with high-end technology. You can use your phone, get augmented reality, get almost like a digital tour guide to guide you through. So we've tried to adopt that as much as we can, and we've noticed that, as you rightfully mentioned, the tech startups are best suited for that. Again, the demographic of the UAE is challenging, with 90% being international residents. So even trying to digitize some of these solutions would also help attract and focus on the best talent, and then maybe reduce, let's say, the lower talent, and maybe increase productivity overall in the sector. This also spans across not only on the tour guide side, but also on the hospitality side, on even the way you conduct and you book your stay. I've even met a UAE-based startup that's actually utilizing cryptocurrency for hospitality, and they're already been successful. They've got, I think, about 18 hotels on board. So they are quite creative in understanding how can we make this sector more efficient, and how can we make the experience for the tourist more secure and more personalized. Mass tourism right now is, I think, from my personal view, has stagnated. I think you'll find a lot of demand for personalized tourism, and that will only be driven through technology adoption, through things like AI and mass data processing.
Okay, very good. I wanted to see if we can explore a variety of sectors here, because in the first round there was collaboration MOUs on AI, defense electronics, tourism, the port of Jebel Ali, for example, and offering such a huge market of 2 billion consumers to Israelis. But I'd love to hear, particularly of the Minister of Industry and Commerce from Bahrain, Zayed Al Zayani. I mean, you're across so many different sectors. What do you think holds the most potential here as we look at beyond tourism and development of the other sectors of the economy?
I think Bahrain is well positioned to be a logistic hub for Israeli companies. We have a very excellent logistic. To start with, geographically, we're in the middle of the Gulf, so we're in the heart of the Gulf, and we're accessible by road, air, and sea to all of the Gulf countries. That's one field. I think there's a lot of potential to do with Israel on pharmaceuticals, on agriculture, desalination, and water treatment. And these are all issues or sectors that are under my economic portfolio, which I intend to push forward with my Israeli counterparts. Biomedical is another possibility that we can explore with Israel, and medicine in general. Banking is a huge sector for us in Bahrain. Banking is the second largest sector in Bahrain. You have to understand that the composition of our economy, only 18% of our GDP comes from oil, and another about 6 or 7% comes from natural gas. So 1/4 of our GDP is energy related, and the rest is split up between industry, banking, aluminum. Aluminum is a huge sector for us in Bahrain. It's our largest industrial sector. Alba, our smelter, is the largest smelter in the world. We do about 1.4 billion tons of aluminum a year. So we feel that there is a lot of potential to develop downstream industry with Israel and industry in general. But I think banking, IT, fintech, pharmaceutical, these are the sectors we're moving in our economy, and that's where we would like to develop further with our Israeli partners.
Good. Minister Farkash Haqqan, you talked about it briefly earlier, but it seems to be quite a bit of interest in Israelis coming to the Gulf for a second home and vice versa. A lot of the Gulf Arabs, so my experience of living here for nearly 10 years, they've invested in Turkey, they've looked at Central and Eastern Europe, investments into Austria and Germany as well. Do you see this area of real estate developing on both sides of the equation in your view, Minister?
Sure, I think this is another, aspect of true bonding between people and cultures, and I think that maybe it will develop at first in the main cities in Israel, meaning i.e. Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and maybe these properties buying and so on would be an illustration of maybe a commerce relationship between the countries strengthening and so on. And I think it might start with, representative of mutual company representatives and businesses that might, want to have a place to stay so that it will be a better managed and better looked at. And hopefully it will even get, as this peace agreement will be more stable and more would age and would be more not so fresh. I totally see people that if they come and they like Israel, and on the other side like the other places, because what's special about it is that it is very nearby, it is close to each other, and there is something about Israel, in my view, that it is like it's a home, it's very familiar with a lot. It is still the Mediterranean, it is still a familiar environment, but might add some different flavors. So sure, I hope this would be the case.
Okay, very good. Another question that came in online for you, Mr. Farkash Haqqan. What will the GCC do? I'm kind of curious, what are the requirements that the GCC needs to do make it kosher and Hebrew attractive? And then I'll present the question to Dr. Ahmed as well. What would you say are the 5 key priorities for Israeli visitors to feel that it meets the kosher and Hebrew guidelines that they live by?
When they visit in the Emirates or Bahrain?
Yes, and I'd love to hear Dr. Balou say what the preparations. I know Emirates is doing it. We're starting to see the catering, but I'd love to hear it from the minister saying like, well, this is what we kind of consider the norm if we're traveling to different parts of the world.
It depends on what sort of population we're talking about. In Israel, it is a very colorful society. We have circular Israelis, which frankly don't have any kosher limitation. But we do have quite a lot of people who are traditional and, of course, Orthodox and more observant that they would like, kosher food would, I think, a big barrier to bring over families, or in Jewish holidays, I think the people would be more of coming and staying for the whole holidays. I think that keeping kosher or giving kosher options, or even when it is not possible economically to show vegetarian options, that would really help to many Israelis that are more observant Jews. And of course, if we're talking about other even more observant, then they can come with organized tour, and they can accommodate with their own limitations. But sure, I think it can be an upgrade of the tourism experience, and I think that it will open the gates to a longer stays and a more comfortable one to a much wider variety of Israelis.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Ahmed, do you want to share some of we saw Emirates make the move. You said some hotels are providing some catering already. Give us a sense of the initiative and the take-up by the hospitality sector here in the UAE.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned before, because we receive tourists from different parts of the world who are already accustomed to providing different types of dietary conditions, including religious ones. But I'd also like to talk about this more from a business perspective. You know, the halal market is $1.9 trillion economy, and the UAE is very big on that. Now, Gulf food exhibition happens in the UAE. It's the biggest one regionally, but we've never entered into kosher. So now that's a window for us, not only to make it available for tourists, but also from a commercial proposition to also offer kosher food globally. So I think there is a case to be made. I think this tourism is always an icebreaker, right? It opens up the business deals, opens up the cultures. And I think providing kosher meals domestically is one aspect, but I think there's also an aspect of commercial appeal globally as well, using Dubai as a hub for other countries in the region.
Yes, I saw that firsthand with the Gulf food. You're right. It's such a huge exhibition, and the halal market is growing so fast. Zayed Al-Zayyan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on your big neighbor. It seems like it's the little Spartas of the GCC and Bahrain and the UAE that wanted to be first movers and forge this peace and dialogue with Israel. What's the sense you're getting in the neighborhood here? I know this is a politically sensitive issue, but I'm sure those watching would like to hear. I'm hearing even rumblings before the end of the year we could have the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia sign on to the Abraham Accords. Is there, and it's a much more populous country, so I know that it needs to get political backing for this. What's your sense now on the expansion of the Abraham Accords from the GCC states?
I think, John, it's not secret that, you know, when the UAE and Bahrain decided to take this momentous and historic step, that there was coordination within the GCC. Each country, of course, runs its own pace, looking at its own progression in the accord. But I think the gates are open now. I mean, we've seen Sudan coming on board, so it's beyond the GCC. Really, it's in my opinion, it's a pan-Arab thing, not just a GCC thing. And of course, we've had Egypt and Jordan ahead of us. But what's remarkable is the pace. I mean, it took, God knows what, 20, 25 years with 2 countries, and it took maybe 2 months with 3. So we expect it to be even more exponential going into the future. I'm not in a position to line them up and say that's going to be next and that's going to follow. But there is general acceptance. I mean, I was curious when the first flight took off from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi, and I was monitoring the flight just out of curiosity, and I saw that it traveled right over Saudi skies and right over Riyadh.
Yes.
That was a statement, and it wouldn't have happened if the Saudi authorities wouldn't have allowed it. And the same with the flight that came to Bahrain. It went, you know, I don't know if it was a 3-hour flight. It probably was over Saudi airspace for 2.5 of that 3 hours.
Yes.
So there is coordination in the GCC. It doesn't mean that we will all get there on the same day, but you know, there is no resistance as far as I can say, and just give it time, and it will come through, I think.
Okay, very good. Let me just follow up with Dr. Ahmed here on that. You know, I see a confidence in Bahrain and a confidence in the UAE and a maturity in terms of foreign policy. I'm not saying there was a lack of sophistication, but it says a lot to have 2 smaller states that are bold enough, confident enough in their foreign policy to make a move like this. What has changed here in the UAE in that respect, Dr. Ahmed?
To be honest, I don't think much has changed. I think if you look at the UAE, you've always been progressive. The UAE has always been based on a message of peace. That the actual foundation of the UAE was the unification of 7 emirates who had their own sovereignty. So we've always been about peace and prosperity. As I said before, in our DNA, we're used to interacting with international tourists. And even you go a decade or two ago, we had merchants dealing with countries from Iran to India to Indonesia. So naturally, being a coastal country, we're very much open. And I think it was just a matter of time to find the right opportunity. And as His Excellency Zayed Azayani mentioned, I think peace is contagious, and it spreads very quickly. We've seen how Bahrain, Sudan are picking it up. I expect much more countries to line up because remember the condition in which Egypt and Jordan signed the peace treaty, it was to avoid war. Now, UAE and Bahrain are not in war with Israel. It's actually truly based on peace. It's truly based on opening doors. And I think the new generation right now realizes that differences cannot be resolved unless you go on a path of prosperity. The UAE has been sending a message of hope, as you know, the Mars Hope probe, which is now almost half of the way through. We're trying to signal that if you focus on collaboration, if you focus on technology, if you focus on opening up to cultures, there's a lot of economic prosperity coming out of it. And we've seen how other countries, when you don't have prosperity for the younger population, their brains could be hijacked. So when you show an example of countries like UAE and Bahrain and Sudan who are brave enough to take that step and say, you know what, it's not as bad as been, painted to people, that we're all, at the end of the day, human beings with the same basic needs. So that's an important distinction between the peace treaty that happened 25 years ago to the peace treaties happening today, which are purely based out of good intention and not just to avoid war.
Great. I want to finish with your thoughts here on the opportunity for Expo. So let me start with Orit Farkash Hakohen. Are you going to be a country that participates in the Dubai Expo? And does that give a chance? We talk about connecting minds and cultures here at the crossroads of East and West. That seems like a very obvious opportunity for Israel to show its wares and to show solidarity. And I'll ask the same of Zayed and then finish with Dr. Ahmed, if I may. Orit, do you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. I think a lot of the ministries in Israel see Expo as a great opportunity and a great event and a great initiative. The Ministry of Tourism is going to invest millions of shekel in participating in the Expo and presenting what Israel has to offer. By the way, it is not only the Ministry of Tourism, there is a heavy investment by the State of Israel in the Expo, in the future, in the coming Expo. It is led by the Foreign Affairs Ministry, but not only that, the Strategic Ministry Affairs, the Tourism Ministry, the Economic Ministry, the Science Ministry. I think I can't even think of one ministry that didn't dedicate some of its budget to be part of the presentation of the many aspects of the coming Expo. We see that as a great opportunity to show the many opportunities that Israel has. And again, I think it is a little bit what's very fascinating about the Emirates doing things big, doing things in a way that exceeds all expectation and doing everything in a wow way. And we love it, and we are very committed to participating in it. And if I may say, before we finish something, somebody's here reminded me, tomorrow in the Israeli parliament, we are about to affirm the agreement with Bahrain. We had that already with the agreement with the Emirates, and it's a very festive occasion where the whole of the Israeli parliament comes together, and every minister, of course, with the prime minister, gives a speech about the peace agreement. We had that with regards to the Emirates, and tomorrow it will be about Bahrain. And if I may say so, I think I'm going to quote many of the same that my colleagues said here today in this panel, and I'm going to deliver it directly to the Israeli parliament and the Israeli public. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Ora. Thanks for finishing on that note. Zaya, do you want to share your thoughts? It's the first Arab nation to host a World Expo, and I would imagine it's a darn good opportunity to build on the Abraham Accords in terms of the messaging. What's the plans from Bahrain and participation?
I mean, we're definitely going to be there, and in a big sense. For us, we consider Bahrain and the UAE partners in any initiative, really, whether it's economical or otherwise. And the expo happening in Dubai is a moment of pride for all Bahrainis as well. So we will be there like we have been in other expos, but with much more bigger presence. We will use it to support our brothers and sisters in the UAE as well as to promote Bahrain. If I may add one point, John,
yes.
Going back to a point that His Excellency Dr. Ahmed mentioned, why are we really doing all this? We're doing this for the simple fact to create peace and prosperity in the region. Because we have challenges coming up, we have a growing population, we need to create more diversified economies. And that doesn't happen in a turbulent region. We need to have peace to create stability, which leads to prosperity. And that was the driving initiative of Bahrain in 2019 when we hosted the Peace to Prosperity Conference in Bahrain. And before signing any peace treaty, we invited Israelis and Americans to come here for a two-day dialogue, and Palestinians to come here for a two-day dialogue on how to make the region more prosperous and more peaceful. The biggest effect we face today is a growing population, a young population, and the worst thing that can happen to them is that they lose hope. And then that could lead them to extremism or terrorism or just giving up on life and having no ambition to build, but rather a wrecking force to destroy. So it's our jobs really as government officials to make sure that we spread peace and prosperity. And I think today I'm very glad that Bahrain is being presented to the Knesset tomorrow. We will watch with pride and anticipation, and hopefully we'll call you tomorrow to say thank you for the words you put in. You can use anything I said, by the way. It's not copyrighted and it's free.
I will thank you, and I will say that you said it.
Yeah,
yes, and it's on record on CNN too.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say it's all out there. But it's extraordinary the conversation, though. It's extraordinary the conversation we're having because you couldn't even have had it 6 months ago. Go ahead.
Yeah. But I want to just stress on the issue of prosperity. Prosperity is what builds economies, what leads to stability, and what gives hopes to nations to grow. And that is really the ultimate goal of doing all of this.
Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Ahmed, you have about 90 seconds, 2 minutes to wrap it up for us. What are your thoughts? And I would imagine in terms of the expo and looking at some of the vaccine progress that we're hearing about now, the last 24 hours, I would imagine that the timing for October and that delay for a year would look very pressing at this stage.
Absolutely. So I think it was a very tough one on us. We've all been excited for Expo. We've been here long enough to know the build-up and the excitement to have it ready on time. The decision was made to delay it. And to be honest, today, looking back in hindsight, had we not delayed it, we would not had Israel come and join us in a big way. And I think this is a huge platform. The slogan of the event is connecting minds, creating the future. And we are literally connecting minds between Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, Israel, and others as well. And that will be a great opportunity for Israel within the MENA region, where officials and your average person coming in to have a look and understand what Israel has to offer. Because again, change is one thing to have it top down, but it's a whole different thing to have it bottom up. I think the Expo as an event will allow these millions and millions of people from the region to come by, have a visit, maybe for the first time, have a peek at Israeli culture. And even as a business person, understand the potential there. And once you get that momentum, as His Excellency Zaid Zayani mentioned, it's a matter of time, I think, when you'll see much more countries lining up at the government level and opening up and widening the Abraham Accord, I should say. So you're all
Great.
welcome to join us in October.
I appreciate that invitation. I can remember when the Israeli representative joined ARENA, and they had to have representation as an international organization here in the UAE. And that was, I think, 7 years ago. And I thought, something's up. That's the big game breaker. And it took 7 years to develop. But we know how the UAE works, kind of quiet diplomacy to get to where they need to get. It's been an absolute pleasure. Dr. Ahmed Bahlul, Zayed Al-Zayani, Oret Farkash Hakohen. It's really a pleasure. I appreciate the questions that came in from the audience and the great organization behind the WTM, which is not my first time with the group. It's the first time virtually, but we're all getting used to it. And hopefully, God willing, the clouds lift for us and we can have a breakthrough in the second half of the year. I do hope so. My warmest regards to all three of you, and thanks for your participation. Best regards.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.